Hello Greeblies and welcome to today's video. So this is going to be another full diorama. So after I did the obelisk diorama, I was contacted by Natural Causes asking if he could commission me to make another Ark diorama. He wanted it to be something quite small, he wanted a house, he wanted a supply drop, and he wanted it to be in the style of Ark Survival Ascended, so the remastered version of Ark. And of course I jumped at the chance of doing this because I love Ark and I love making dioramas. So the first thing I did was hop into the game and start making a little house on the beachfront, so like a little Bob's hut. Because he said he wanted it to really sort of, when you look at it you go, yeah, that's Ark, so, you know, what's more Ark than a beach Bob? And then it was time to start making, so hopefully you guys enjoy the process, even a fraction of the amount as I enjoyed making this, because this was so much fun. So let's get started. So my original plan was to make each of the structures on the house, so each like wall 9 centimeters by 9 centimeters. I wanted to make it out of coffee stirrers, so I've cut up all of these coffee stirrers. And while I was doing this, I realized that if I wanted each wall to be 9 centimeters by 9 centimeters, this was going to be massive. Like, the house would be the size that the actual diorama would need to be because he wanted something quite small. So I had to come up with something else. But I'm glad I cut up these coffee stirrers because we are going to use them a bit later on. So my next idea was to make it out of foam, have a little foam house. I've seen people scribing details into foam and it comes out looking really cool. You can make it look quite realistic. So I've got a new fancy wire cutter and I'm using that to cut up the foam and then make a little house out of it. Gluing it together with some PVA glue. Pop on the little peak at the front. And then once I started scribing the details into this, I thought, it's not working. I want it out of wood. But it's not going to be a waste. I am going to use the little house as a template to stick the wood walls to. So it's got like a solid interior, if that makes sense. So all is not lost. I'm going to set this aside and then we're going to start working on the base. I've got a really thick piece of cardstock that I want for the actual base, and I'm just drawing around it onto some XPS foam. And then we can cut it out with the ruler and a knife. And check that it fits. I've done the same with an extra piece of foam as well, and I'm just going to glue them together. I probably could have used a thicker piece of foam, but I wasn't sure how thick I wanted this initially. And we can pop the house on there to get an idea of scale. So I've got some offcuts from the previous diorama that I want to make use of. So I'm going to cut those off on the foam cutter and put them aside for later. So now I want like a cliff face on the diorama. So I am going to use these little blocks of foam and just cut into them with my handheld foam wire cutter. Just to get a bit of texture. And now we're going to primer the base with some Mod Podge and black paint. I'm just going to cut some details into the foam just to make it look a bit more rock surfacey. And then we can tidy up and start gluing it together. Something weird's happened to my tacky glue. I'm not sure what, but I've had to take the nozzle off and just do it this way. So I'm going to spread that on and stick this down. And that's looking alright. It's kind of what I imagined in my head, so we're good to go. Now I'm sticking the whole thing down to the thick piece of card that I primered. And I'm going to weigh it down with my vise while it dries. Now I'm just giving the front and the sides a bit of a sand to smooth them out. And with the bits that are sticking out on the side, I'm back to the wire cutter to get rid of those because it would have taken me ages to sand these. And I love using my new wire cutter. Okay, now for something fun, we are going to make some texture paste. So I'm just using some PVA glue and some plaster of Paris, mixing that together until it looks kind of like a cake batter. And then I'm going to spread it in between all of the gaps on the diorama to tie it all together a bit. And then with a little bit of water on my finger, I'm just going to go over some of the areas to smooth it into the base. Quite a satisfying thing to do this. Oh, and this is really bad. This is sacrilege, but I've lost the footage of my sand pour. I don't know where it went. So here's some footage of me doing a previous one, so I can kind of show you the process. So I've put some PVA glue down, poured the sand on, then spritzed it with some isopropyl alcohol, just to break up the surface tension a bit, before going over it with some watered down PVA glue to seal it all in. Gutted I lost the footage of that. I don't know where it went. Okay, so now I'm using a pin vise and I'm just going to make a hole in here where I want the drop to go and the wires to come through. I should have done this earlier. I know I should have done it earlier, but I didn't. So now I have to gouge a hole in the back of the diorama because I'm using those cork lights, like a little cork with the fairy lights on it. So I need a place for the cork to go, and it fits quite snug in there and the wire comes through nice, so we are good. And then I need to tidy up the mess I've made in here, so I'm just using some more texture paste that I made to do this. Right, I wasn't happy with the sandy cliff face. I want it to look more rock-like, so I'm going to cut into it and then stick down some plaster rocks that I made previously. Just sticking them down with some hot glue. And then again with some texture paste, I'm just going to fill in all the gaps until I'm happy. Now we just need to primer this bad boy.
Nice.
And once it's primered, we can paint. So I'm going to use some burnt umber, some burnt sienna, and some crimson red, along with some black and some white so I can make some grey shades. So this is going to look a bit crazy at first because I'm dabbing on some red with a sponge. But rocks, when you look at them, have a few different tones to them. They're not just proper grey, you know? So I'm just going to keep going over this with lighter and lighter paints until the top coat is almost a white. And then for a wash, I'm going to use my paintbrush water because it's the right shade I want and it's really watery. And as you can see, it's working quite well. So I'm filling in all the gaps with this, and then I'm going to dab it off with some kitchen roll until I'm happy with the result. And I think we're good. So now we move on to the house. And the coffee sticks were too thick, so I'm having to split them all in half with my knife. So the sheets that I made for templates earlier will actually work as 4 walls instead of 1 wall now. So I'm going to make sure it's all straight, glue it down with some super glue and some super glue activator. And we've got ourselves some structures. Now we need to make the foundation for the house to sit on, so I'm going to use skewers for this. So let's cut them up. And then we're going to glue all these down same way, using some super glue and some activator. Right, it's time to put some detail on these walls. So this is going to be the door and window wall. And I have scribed a line on the centre wall so it looks like 2 walls when it's painted, hopefully. And then you can see my hand shaking really bad here because it was really hard to cut out this window. After a few passes with a knife, we got there, but unfortunately a bit of the wall came out too, but we can just glue that back in, it's not a problem. There we go. So now we need to make the actual window, and I've scored a line halfway down some of these because I don't really fancy cutting them all, but it will look like they are separate beams. And for the details on the wood structures, I've gone for some balsa wood because it's a lot softer and easy to work with. So for the smaller bits, I've thought this is probably the best idea. These are to represent the metal bits on the window. We need a tiny little handle as well, which I'm going to have to position with a toothpick because it's so tiny. And there's the window. So let's do the same for the door, using balsa wood to line it with. Put its tiny little handle on. So I'm going to file down the window and the window frame a bit until I get a really nice snug fit. There we go. Now to attach the door, so I'm going to glue it from the back. And flip it over, and here's what it looks like. So now we're going to add the other wooden trim details to it. So what I've done is, in-game, when I made the building, I flipped the walls, because some people do that in-game because it adds a little bit more detail and it just looks a bit nicer when the wood walls are flipped. So here are our structures, and this is our little torbach. So torbach is kind of Welsh for little roof, and we're going to give that the same treatment as we did with the rest of the structures. And it's starting to look a bit more like what it does in the game now. Now everything gets primered with Mod Podge and black acrylic paint. So I've cut out and primered a small piece of XPS foam for the foundation to go on, and added a few little bits of embellishments like what it has in the game. And now I'm going to just score a line on the middle section of the foam here, and then we're going to add some more wood pieces. For the smaller ones, again I've gone for balsa wood because it's just easier to work with for the fiddly bits. Now we'll trim this off and primer everything that hasn't had a primer yet. Now I can stick down all the walls onto the little foam house. I've been looking forward to this. Feels like it's taken a while to get here. So some of the primer has come away, but that's not a problem. We can just redo that. Okay, so this is going to be a bit weird. I haven't made many things out of clay, but I'm going to have a go at making this chimney. So I'm just using air dry clay, and I've wrapped it around the chimney and smoothing it out with a bit of water. Then I'm taking a clay modelling tool and then just scribing in a brick pattern. I think it looks pretty decent, and I'm quite looking forward to painting it. So if you've got a little wooden shack on Ark, you're gonna need little wooden railings, aren't you? So I've made a few of these as well and set them aside for later. And it is now time to make the shingle roof. So I've marked out on a piece of cardboard where I want all the little grooves to be, and I'm just cutting into it halfway up so that they look like individual tiles. And then I'm gluing all of these down. This took quite a while, but I found it quite relaxing. It was quite a nice experience. So with each consecutive layer, I'm making sure that it only covers half of the layer below it, so that only the cut sections of the tiles are on show. And then we're going to add a bit of flashing to the top bits. I think that's what it's called, isn't it? The bits that they put on the roofs, I'm sure it's called flashing. Either way, we're going to add one to the little torbach at the front. And that looks much better. I've been looking at this for ages and I've been dying to do something with it. I've just been like, oh, that looks proper rubbish. So it's coming together a little bit now and I'm a bit happier with it. So once that's primed and had time to dry, it's time to paint. So I've started off with the burnt sienna, just kind of dry brushing it on. And then I tried a bit of tan. I wasn't happy, so I've gone over it with a yellow. And I did the whole house in this yellow, and I've left it for a bit to dry while I do the door and a bit of the window detail, but I couldn't get out of my mind how much I hated this yellow. It just looked so bad. So I still had to wait a bit longer for it to dry, and I've decided to work on the chimney. So a light coat of grey first, and then I'm just picking out certain bricks and adding a bit of different colour to it, just different oranges, browns and tans. And while I wait for that to dry, I'm going to add some detail to the chimney with some balsa wood, because it always has that little lip on the end, doesn't it? And then we're going to brush over what we've done on the chimney with some greys, gradually getting lighter as usual. And now we come back to the house itself, and I'm going to just have to try and cover up this yellow as best I can. So we're going to go over it with the brown first, and then add a black wash to everything. Dabbing it off with a kitchen towel as usual. And you can see the black has seeped into all the crevices and looks quite nice. And for a final coat, I've mixed together some browns to get this colour here. So I've sponged that over the whole house. I'm so much happy with how this looks. So I'm going to glue on all of the railings and finally breathe a sigh of relief, because I've spent about 3 days painting this house to try and get it how I wanted it. So Mr. Causes asked for a supply drop in his diorama, and I was so confused by this. I didn't know how I was going to do it. So I started out with cardboard, and I made like a little diamond shape, so it's a similar shape to the drops. Then I put cocktail sticks all around it, thinking maybe I could use this as some kind of a frame. I wasn't happy with that, so I cut all of it out until I was left with just the cardboard frame. And then I've cut out these bits of mesh to go over the top, so that the lights will shine through it, you know? And I did primer this cardboard frame, but I was not happy with it. It looked messy, and so I wanted to make something new. So I just used it as a template to make something out of coffee stirrers. And I'm using the tip of a cocktail stick to pop in the top here to give a bit of extra structure and something for the rest of the sides to adhere to. And I'm so much happier with this. I feel like it looks so much better than that shoddy piece of cardboard that I had. So let's primer it. And now this mesh doesn't take glue very well. It doesn't adhere very well at all. So I'm burning it. And for some reason, this just helps the glue to actually work on it. So that's what we're doing. And once I've glued it on, I'm going to trim off any edges that are sticking over. And then we're going to stick on a few more of these. So now I've done a little test fit with it as it is on the diorama. You'll see that the diorama is in different phases of being done at the moment. So the house and the rocks are still like this because I was back and forth between different things the whole time. So I've needed to keep one section open on the drop. So what I've done is just tie some black elastic around one of the top edges so that we've still got this little flappy bit here, which we're going to have to work around until we attach this to the diorama, because the lights need to go in before I can fix it in place. I've got some thin EVA foam for the details on the drop, and I've scribed some details into it. And I'm just going to open up the gaps with a toothpick. And then I've stuck one down and I quite like it, so I've decided I'm going to stick the rest down too. There we go. It's starting to look a bit more like a drop now, but we do need legs. So I've put it on the diorama and attached some cocktail sticks to it in the right length that they need to be. And the drops do have some like little, I'm going to call them shoes. They're not shoes obviously, but the little things that are on the ends of the legs. So I'm making those out of EVA foam as well and gluing on a little bit of cardboard to the back just to stiffen them up a bit. So let's glue them on and see what we think. Yeah, I think that looks alright. So we've got to make the tack tendrils around the legs now. And I'm using foam clay for this and a clay modelling tool just to scribe some of the detail lines into the foam clay. And then a little bit of water as well, so my fingers are a bit manky, but I think it was worth it because it's looking alright. And as for painting it, I first put the mesh over it and started using a car primer to try and get like that techie pattern on it, but I wasn't happy. So I've painted over it with some blacks, some silvers, some gunmetal, and I think it looks a lot better. So for the detail, I've put some silver paint onto the very edge of a sponge, and I'm just dabbing that onto it. Little bit of highlighting on the outer edges. And then I've put some black on a smaller sponge and I'm just dabbing that over the silver bits. And now I've gone for an acrylic varnish, which works quite well on EVA foam. And I'm going to cover the whole thing in this because it is tack at the end of the day and it's got a bit more of a shimmer to it. So hopefully this will work. Okay, and now I want to make a tree. I've never made a tree before, but I've seen someone doing it on YouTube this way. I can't remember who, and I wanted to have a go. So I'm using some craft wire from the range. I've cut it up, and I've twisted sections together, and I'm just taking one separate piece of wire and wrapping it around so it keeps it all bunched up. And then I'm going to try and make some roots by twisting some of the bottom bits of wire. And I've separated the top bit into 3 pieces. So this is what it looks like. And now I've separated the top bits again, so I'm twisting them, separating them, twisting a few more together until they look a bit more branch-like. And then I'm going to trim them to the sizes I want them. Go over the roots again just to make sure they're nice and tight. A bit more fiddling with this until it looks a bit more tree-ish. So now I'm going to use my glue gun to cover up all the wires and add some details. And these are the roots done. And I've left some of the wires exposed at the top. You can just pull off the stringy bits that are left over from the glue as well. And I'm going to go over it again a few more times. And then I get to use my seafoam trees. I've wanted these for ages, so I ordered these offline, and I am just going to separate them into small bits and just glue them to the exposed wire bits. This was quite a long process, but it was a really enjoyable one. So just using super glue and accelerant, same as usual, till I think I've got enough on there. And then we're going to see what it looks like on the diorama. Yay! My first tree! So then I'm going to primer the whole of the trunk and the branches with the black. And then I'm going to add a light grey, just dabbing it to the raised areas with a sponge. And once that's dry, I'm going to use my spray adhesive and some of this hedge foliage from Javis Countryside Scenics. Put it in a bowl and separated it a bit. So we're going to spray on the adhesive and then sprinkle on the foliage. Or do you know what? Let's just pour the bowl over it. Bit more spray, and then we're going to use some of this turf, which again is from Countryside Scenics, and sprinkle that all around. And this is what it looks like after a bit of foliage. So I still need to continue painting the trunk, so I'm going to use a light brown and dab that to the raised areas before adding a black wash and dabbing that off with a kitchen towel. And now we wait for it to dry. We made a tree! Okay, so this is a little bit of a tense one now. We're going to have to do the epoxy pour. So I'm just sanding down the edges of the diorama in preparation. Now, I did do a separate video on the epoxy pour, which is on the channel here if you want more of an in-depth video about epoxy pours. I'll put a link to it in the description below. And I've got this 2-part epoxy off eBay. It's a lot better than the stuff that I used on the last diorama. It is a little bit more expensive, but it's so worth it. So I'm using some greens, blues and whites just to paint the ocean floor before the epoxy goes on, making it darker in the deeper areas and getting lighter as it goes up into the sand. And then I'm using some of this clear packaging to mask it out. I'm just going to glue it down with some PVA glue, and I've put it in a box and added some EVA foam in there just to hold it all tight while the glue dries. And then just going over the edges with a bit more PVA glue just to make sure it's all sealed before we do the pour. So this is a 1-to-1 ratio on this epoxy, which always works well for me because it makes it a bit more simple. So we're going to pour those into 1 cup and then mix it for 6 minutes. 6 minutes is a lot longer than what you think when you're stirring. Then I've added in a colourant to make it a nice vibrant blue. And for a bit of extra protection, I've added some hot glue to the very bottom seam just to make extra sure that nothing leaks because it's time for the pour. So I got some of these fancy sticks with this epoxy, so I'm going to use that to pour the epoxy on first before it goes onto the actual diorama, and this will prevent as many bubbles. And any bubbles that did rise to the surface, I just burnt them with a lighter and then they disappeared. So the next day we come back and it's dry, so we can remove all of the glue, all of the packaging, and then we can peel off that PVA. And as you can see, it's turned out real nice. I was really relieved about this. So there is a bit that looks a bit rough near the base of the diorama, but I'm not too fussed about this because we are going to be covering that a bit later on. And now we need some waves. So I'm going to use some clear gloss Mod Podge. It doesn't look clear now, but once it's dry it will be. Once I've put that on, I'm just airbrushing to move it all around and give it more of a natural wavy texture. Now I came back the next day and it had dried all clear and I'm really pleased. You can see the reflection of the waves on the bottom of the ocean, so I'm really happy. So after the tense epoxy pour, we can do something real fun. Flocking! So I did a little test video on static grass where I tried out some 2mm static grass on a diorama that the Dino Lord had previously done years ago. So I'm feeling a bit more confident about this. So I've got myself some 6mm spring grass, which I love the colour of, and I've put PVA glue all on the base in the areas where I want the flocking to be. So I'm going to put my wire into the glue and then start shaking the flocking machine. And I was so happy when I seen how this came out. It's standing on end so beautifully. Like I said, I used 2mm on the practice one, so I didn't know how good this was going to turn out. And I was, yeah, absolutely buzzing with this. So once we're done, we clean up using a vacuum cleaner, which I have attached a pair of cut-off tights to the end so that I can save the leftover flocking for a future project. Oh, come on, let's put the house on and see what it's going to look like. Woohoo! Right, so now comes the bit where we're going to cover up all this dodgy stuff at the base. So I'm using coffee stirrers again, gluing them around the base, and I'm going to do this all around the sides of the diorama as well. I really like the way it looks. I just think it adds a little something to it. I'm going to paint over this with a really watered down brown, so that it gets into all of the crevices. So now I need to make a plaque for the back of the diorama, which will cover up the battery hole. So I've used skewers and coffee stirrers for this, and my little plaque fits in nicely. And it's now time to start adding the final details. So we can finally put the lights into the drop and seal up the flap. Glue that in place, then we can glue the tree down and start doing my favourite bit, adding all of the foliage. This was one of the most relaxing days I had had in ages, just adding all the extra plants, all the extra foliage and the little details. So this box I've had for a while and I haven't had a chance to use it yet. So this was kind of a similar circumstance to the seafoam trees. I'd keep running in with my box and saying to the Dino Lord, have you seen my little box of stuff? You see my box of stuff? And he's like, yes, you show it to me every night. He said he's glad that I've actually finally had a chance to be able to use this stuff, so I shut up about it. So on the cliff face rocky area, I've just put some super glue in certain areas, just picked out a few different areas, and then sprinkled on some turf just to give the effect that there's moss on them. I didn't want to go too overboard on this, but I felt like it kind of needed it, you know? And I'm just making some holes to add some more of these seafoam trees. And then with other bits of the seafoam, I'm just gluing them in place and adding lots more tufts to the diorama. And with that, we come to the end of the build. This has been an absolute pleasure to work on. I really hope you enjoyed the video. Now let's take a look at the final shots.